Good morning, everyone. I haven't started with something funny for a while, so I thought, well, I saw two things this week that I thought were kind of cute or funny, so I'll start with that today. The first one that I ran across was I thought went well because the tractor drive is tomorrow. So this little girl was watching her dad repair his tractor. And she asked her mother, she said, "Mom, what happens to tractors when they finally stop working?" And with a big sigh, the mother answered, she said, "Someone sells them to your father, dear." And so here's the other one. These two bachelors were talking about various things one time, and they started to talk about cooking. And the one bachelor says to the other, he says, "I got a cookbook once, but I could never do anything with it." The other bachelor says, "Why is that? Is there too much fancy cooking in there for you?" He said, "Yes." And he said, "Every recipe said to start with a clean dish," which I never have in my apartment. All right, this morning we're continuing our message series, What About? And I'm taking the questions that you have submitted, and we're looking into God's Word to learn what the Lord tells us about these various things. Today are the subjects of evangelism, judgment, and dedicated faith. So let's turn together to that passage that we just saw on the screen, Matthew chapter 9 in our Bibles. And before we read those four short verses, at the end of chapter 9, I feel like we need to set the context here. You know, what brings Jesus to this point where he says this to his disciples? We know in chapters 5 through 7 of Matthew that Jesus preached the Sermon on the Mount. And then we're going to actually mention a couple things this morning from that Sermon on the Mount. And then in chapters 8 and 9, Jesus begins to perform many miracles. He heals a man with leprosy. He heals the centurion's servant who was paralyzed. He heals Peter's mother-in-law. He calms the storm on the Sea of Galilee. He heals a demon-possessed man, as well as healing an elderly woman. And then he heals those who are blind and mute. I mean, Jesus in those chapters, he was on a roll. And he was gaining believers and followers along the way as he was doing those miracles and showing those things. And so that brings us to verses 35 to 38 of chapter 9, which is our main text this morning. And verse 35 says this: "Jesus went through all the towns and villages, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom, and healing every disease and sickness. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them, because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. Then he said to his disciples, 'The harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers into the harvest field.'" Well, as Glen mentioned, next Sunday is our annual Fall Harvest Festival for our church, which means that we are at that time of year when the farmers are going to kick it in high gear here in the next several weeks. And, you know, when it comes to harvest time, it takes a lot of extra workers. Some farmers have to hire extra help in order to bring in that harvest each fall. And so I was wondering, you know, what happens if some of the farmers one fall were not able to find the help that they needed? I mean, not only, you know, would it take them much longer to bring in the harvest, but in some cases, in some people's situation, it might make it impossible. I realize now we have a lot of modern technology, of course, that helps with that situation somewhat, but it still takes people to run the combines and the tractors and the trucks to not only bring in the harvest, but to get it to the elevator or wherever else it's going. In Israel, during this time, or even today, they don't have fields and fields of corn and soybeans like we have here in central Illinois. But they do harvest other things. They harvest things like barley, wheat, grapes, fruits, and olives. Actually, they do. I looked into it, and they do grow some form of corn there, but I'm pretty sure, I've been there, and I'm pretty sure it's not like anything that we have in our fields around central Illinois here. But when Jesus says the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few, he's not talking about corn, wheat, or barley. He's talking about those who are lost and in need of hearing the good news of the kingdom of heaven. In verse 36, it says, when he saw the crowds that were following him, he had compassion on them. Yes, we know from those chapters and other places in the gospel that he healed many people and he performed wonderful miracles. But the reason for that, along with, showing people he was the Son of God as he said he was, the other reason was he had compassion on those people who were in need and had those various needs. Some of them were lost. Some of them were weary. Probably some of them were lonely. We definitely know some of them were outcast. And we can be assured that there were some who had numerous challenges in their life. And yet, they were embraced by Jesus as a part of this harvest that he is speaking of. So this morning we ask, what is our part in that? That leads us to the term of evangelism. Many people today are wondering, and rightly so, what does it mean to be an evangelist? What does it mean to when people speak of evangelism? And what is a Christian evangelical in today's world? Unfortunately, that term has become more of a political label here in recent years, and I believe it has distracted people from what evangelism really is and needs to be about. The word evangelism actually comes from a Greek word that literally means gospeling, or in other words, it means sharing the gospel or the good news of Jesus Christ. From these words of Jesus in Matthew 9, I think it can also mean having compassion, first and foremost, on those who are in need of help, who are in need of healing and restoration, along with sharing with them the good news of salvation in Jesus. I mean, that should be what an evangelical Christian is all about. It should have nothing to do with politics or other labels that are not related to the harvest of souls that Jesus is talking about here. Now, do evangelicals have political leanings and theological convictions or cultural preferences? Sure, everyone does. But our call to be workers in this harvest that Jesus is talking about is to be caring, compassionate, and dedicated to sharing the gospel and winning souls for Christ. You see, evangelicals are to be about the harvest for Jesus, not about who is in the White House or who is not. When Jesus shared his agenda with us, it was about coming to seek and to save the lost. Other agendas that were out there during Jesus' time, even if they were good or they were worthwhile, they were always secondary. to that main call that Jesus has placed on our lives. Evangelist Billy Graham really brought this term of evangelism to the forefront of Christian conversations. Most likely, it grew during his massive crusades around the world in the 1950s and 1960s. I saw an interesting statistic recently that if you ask most of the people between 20 and 30 years old today, and you say Billy Graham, many of them have no idea who that is. Now, a lot could be said about that. Yes, a lot of time has passed, but the impact that Billy Graham had should you would think, leave a lot of people to know his place in history, especially within Christianity. But perhaps that has something to do with the disconnect today with church and Christianity and so on. But that's another whole subject. Some other people would say it wasn't only Billy Graham, but it was ministries back in the early 40s or so, or early 50s that started. And some of you might not realize that some of these are that old. Campus Crusade for Christ started in the 40s. World Vision also started during that time. Youth for Christ. All of those started during those years. And of course, those ministries are still going strong today. And evangelism, or bringing in the harvest, is still the main goal. Is it our main goal? Do we care about those who need Jesus, who need salvation, and who need the good news of the gospel in their lives? Do we really want to reach them, or do we treat them as if they are outsiders? Well, I think that leads us to consider the term judgment or judging in Scripture. Many wonder about the judgment at the end of time, and we actually talked about that already last month when we talked about the end times and why, the whole judgment of the end times is why this harvest that we're talking about today is so important. There will be a final judgment someday in the future. That's up to God. But what about the judging that takes place in the here and now? The judging that sometimes keeps us from participating in the harvest. I would guess that probably most all of us are guilty of this at one point or another in our life. Back in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus said, "Do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the same way that you judge others, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured to you." So, too often we judge others as unworthy, unfit, unchangeable, and maybe even sometimes unforgivable. Too often we look at others and say, they are one of them, instead of trying to include them as one of us. Too often we use words of criticism or condemnation instead of showing care and compassion for others. Last Sunday, before they left, Claire Good, who shared the message last Sunday from MCC, he gave me a book that he and his daughter had written 6 years ago. And in the very first chapter, I haven't read the whole book yet, but I started it, kind of looked into the first chapter. And in that very first chapter, he shares about his second grade teacher that one day told him to come to the front of the class in front of everybody, where she slapped his hand and said, "Claire Good, if you can't learn to pay attention, you will never amount to anything." Those last words were so hurtful to him, he shares. He said that he dropped his head. He tried to hold back tears as he stood there in front of the class. But he said, I couldn't control my trembling chin from what I had just been told. And he goes on and he says, my teacher's words would echo in my mind for years to come. You will never amount to anything. Words and attitudes like that, of course, can cause deep pain and hurt in people, especially in a young second grader. But we need to be careful about that our words and attitudes about others don't judge them as a lost cause. We need to see others in the way that Jesus sees them. They are children of God, created in His image, and His compassion for them should be reflected in our response and our attitudes towards them. You know, they need saved for all of eternity, just like we all need to be saved for all of eternity. So instead of judging them, we need to show compassion for them. So I ask you to think about, who does that bring to mind in your life right now? Someone at work maybe, somebody at school, maybe it's a neighbor. Who does that bring to mind that you've had interactions with, maybe haven't responded in the way that we should? Have you been compassionate? Have you been caring? Or have you been judgmental and critical of them? I ran across a Christian music duo from Nashville recently with the name Apollo Limited. And, I have Spotify. I listen to a lot of music. I love music of a lot of different genres and so on. And sometimes when you pick a song, like a Christian song, and you just let it play out, Spotify will give you other groups or songs that you may have never heard of before. And that happened to me on this one. I had never heard of this group. So then, of course, I go on Wikipedia or the internet, and I start looking into who are these two guys called Apollo Limited. They have a song that really speaks to people who are hurting. And it tells them that they have worth and they have value in the eyes of God. People need to hear that. And perhaps some of us here this morning even need to hear that. But here's what the lyrics say. Inside you're hurting, you're worried, you're not deserving of a lifeline. But the hands that hold the stars say you are. You're still a heart worth chasing. There's love reaching deeper. Behind the hurt in your eyes, there's a diamond that can still shine. I hope someday you realize what heaven already knows. You've got a soul worth saving. You're still a heart worth chasing. Of course, Erica's song this morning, as she said, speaks well to this as well. There is one gospel where hope is found. As the front of our bulletin says this morning, we are, as believers and followers of Jesus, we are entrusted with that gospel. To share it, to live it, and believe it for ourselves and for others. And this is where we become dedicated to the faith that we proclaim instead of being hoarders of the gospel. We all know, of course, what a hoarder is. They've made numerous reality TV shows in years past about hoarders. It means keeping everything, storing up everything, and not sharing it with someone, or in some cases, just throwing it away. So here's how I'm going to relate this. Jesus does not want us to be hoarders of the good news. Jesus wants us to have an attitude that wants to share it with others and not just say, you know what, I'm saved, I'm redeemed, I'm going to heaven, so who cares about other people? Well, in verse 36 today, of course, it says Jesus had compassion on the people that were helpless or harassed. And he says they're like sheep without a shepherd. And you know, perhaps we haven't spoke words of condemnation on people, but have we given them a chance? Do we really believe that through Christ there is hope for all people? Yes, I'm sure we do. I mean, I'm sure we all believe that, but sometimes our attitudes probably don't communicate that. When we begin to entertain those types of thoughts about other people, it's maybe time to revisit how we ourselves as Christians are connecting with God and this call that He's placed upon our lives. Is our faith dedicated to sharing the good news, or are we just hoarding it for ourselves? We are called to evangelism, which means sharing the gospel. You see, Jesus was intentionally making this statement here with the disciples before He sent them out, which happens in the next chapter. He was making them aware of the human need. He was making them aware of this redemptive mission that they were going to be set out on. And He's also making them aware of their divine purpose in this calling. In many ways, chapter 9 seems to be Jesus' way of saying, look, there is hope available for those in our world whose lives may seem hopeless to you and I. In chapter 10, then, Jesus, of course, sends them out to save the lost. He's calling them to be one of the workers needed for the harvest. I'm always amazed when I see a flower plant come through a crack in the concrete. Some years ago, there was a corn plant that did that out at Levi and Gloria's farm. There was, in front of their house, there was just this small crack between the drive and the sidewalk, but yet this tall corn plant found its way to the light. And I'm sure you've seen that, some other places in the past. Flowers coming out of concrete, like the other picture that's up there. So Jesus is calling His disciples to go out and to find the tiny crack in someone's life in which something beautiful just might begin to grow. If it is watered with hope, and if we water it with the love of Christ. And a lot of that begins with how we view the other person. Do we see the potential change that could come through Christ? Or do we just see them in their current situation? Like I said, I think we probably all of us are picturing a person in our minds already this morning in our own lives. It could be a group of people that you're thinking about. It could be a family. It could be a certain individual or a child. Have we stood in judgment over them? Or have we covered them with care and compassion? Sometimes the harvest field may be in places that we least expect it to be. Sometimes it may come calling to us. I heard a man once say that he doesn't believe in just chance encounters. He said that every contact we have, no matter what form it comes in, is an opportunity to share Christ with someone else. And he gave the example about when he answers the phone and it's somebody who has the wrong number, and instead of just hanging up and telling him he has the wrong number, he says, "Hey, wait a minute." And of course, the answer on the other line would be, "What do you mean? Wait a minute, I have the wrong number." Well, it gives this man the opportunity to just have a conversation, to find out where they're calling from, find out a little bit about them. And then it gives him the opportunity to ask them if they have received Jesus into their life and if they're saved. I mean, that's very creative, and I get that that's maybe not everybody's cup of tea to go about evangelism in that way. But we do need to think about those situations or those people that God places in our life. Why did God place them there? Why are they there in our life? What does Jesus want us to do with that relationship or with that encounter? How might we let them know about this one gospel that we believe in and that we can stand on for all of eternity? In Romans 1:16, passage that was read earlier, Paul said it very clear. He said, "I am not ashamed of the gospel." Why was he not ashamed? Because it's the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes. That's what evangelism is all about. Not being ashamed of the gospel message, not hoarding it to ourselves, but having a desire to fulfill this call upon our lives to be a part of the harvest that Jesus is asking us to be a part of. We need to give everyone a chance without judgment or condemnation. And I really think it boils down to the fact that we need to be dedicated to evangelism instead of judgment. So, in closing here, as we begin to see the harvest taking place around us in the fields here in the next several weeks, I hope that we will be reminded of these words of Jesus here before he sent his disciples out to proclaim that the message, that the kingdom of heaven is near. And that is a message for people in all walks of life, without judgment and without condemnation. Amen? Let's go out and let's be about that as followers of Jesus. Let's stand together and let's go to the Lord and ask for prayer and help with this attitude and approach. We come before you this morning and we realize, Lord, that we fail sometimes at this. We fail to respond with compassion. Maybe the same compassion that you showed to people as you walked this earth and healed them and brought restoration to their lives. Lord, help us to be able to see that seed of hope in every person that you see. Help us to realize that every soul to you is a soul that is worth saving. There's no soul or person that is beyond your grace and your redemption and your salvation. Lord, each person must make that decision for themselves, but we as your followers, we need to make the decision that we are going to be participants in this harvest that you have called us to. This harvest of souls, this harvest of people who need you and need to know the difference you can make in their life. So Lord, as we go out from this time of worship and from hearing your word today, I pray that you would help us to realize that we are evangelists. We are just as important as Billy Graham when it comes to reaching people with the good news of Jesus. So Lord, give us empowerment, help us to not be ashamed of the gospel, and help us to share it with all those who need it with love, with the love and compassion of Jesus Christ. And all God's people said, amen.